Lord, for your glory we have been chosen. We lay down all we have here at your throne.
Sorry about that. Wait a little longer to get everything together. We're studying out the book of Luke, and we've been working through this series. We're in Luke chapter 22. We're going to be about verse 54 here in just a moment. It's interesting we think about this narrative and the various pieces, and we started Wednesday, and I told you Wednesday night, and I'm going to continue to do it this way, probably throughout the rest of the book. But I realize you get more information when you add all the gospel accounts to the same record, right? You get a bigger picture of what's happening and what's occurring and what Jesus says or what he does or what others do if you look at all of them. But rather than just continually going back and forth, what I've done is I've created charts. We're going to look at Luke's record of the account, and then I'll bring up on the screen what Matthew adds, what Mark adds, what John adds, rather than just this continue. So as we're going through Luke's record, just be patient with me. Don't start running me to the other gospel accounts yet. I'll get to them. Just give me a chance to get there. Let's look first at what Luke says about these various moments, and then we'll see what the other gospel accounts add to it. And that'll be our approach really from here on out through the rest of the study. So notice here in verse 54. So what has already occurred? Jesus has already done what in the garden? He's prayed. Right after that, then who shows up? Judas, right? Judas Iscariot shows up. He's got that entourage of folks that he promised that I'll know where he'll be. I've got an opportunity for us to betray him. And he does that with a kiss. He actually tells some of them, Luke doesn't necessarily record this, but that he told them, you'll know who he is by the fact when I kiss him, you'll be able to identify him. That was kind of a conversation Judas has with them. It's interesting as it relates to that, though, so that seems to be the indicator in Matthew's account, Mark's account, Luke's account. John gives us an account more based on Jesus' interaction with whom? You remember from Wednesday? John's account deals in John 18 with Jesus' interaction with the multitude, with the chief priests and the scribes and the servants. Matthew, Mark, and Luke deal with Jesus' interaction with Judas, right? That's the kiss. John didn't even mention the kiss. John didn't even talk about that. John talks about the fact that Jesus says, who you looking for? I'm the guy, right? And so the accounts are different. John kind of deals with how Jesus dealt with that group. Matthew, Mark, and Luke deal with how he interacted with Judas. That was Wednesday night's study. That brings us up to this point here in verse 54, where Peter denies Jesus. Now, Peter denies Jesus based on what? On something Jesus had told him was going to happen, right? And Jesus tells him it's going to happen. He prophesies concerning it. And you remember that whole conversation about when you are converted. Verse 54. Then took they him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house. And Peter followed where? At a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. So you get this imagery, right? There's been an entourage has come into town. They've got Jesus. They bring him bound. We'll learn a little bit more about where they went and when they went there here in just a little bit. But as Luke records the scene, you've got this group of people. They're kind of outside the hall, the gathering place. They've built a little fire. They're kind of warming themselves there. Peter just decides, I think I can blend in here, right? I kind of think that's what's on his mind. I'll just blend in. And he sits down among them. But a certain maid, verse 56, beheld him as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him and said, this man what? This guy was with him. Now, it's interesting, right? How she knew that exactly, we don't necessarily know. Whether she saw him with them on these back and forth trips that they've been making, whether she was there in the garden when they arrested you, who knows? But she's pretty confident. I know this man that's here warming himself with us was with Jesus as well. And what's Peter's response? He denies him, saying, Woman, I know him not. After a little while, another saw him and said, Thou art also of them. And Peter said, what? Man, I am not. Right? And about the space of 1 hour, after another confidently affirmed, saying, Of a truth, this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. So, one comes, this guy was with Jesus. No, I wasn't. Another one says, oh, yeah, you were. No, I wasn't. And then finally, somebody actually doesn't just say it, doesn't just say, we saw you with him, or we've got evidence. Well, what proof do they offer? He's a Galilean. Now again, bear with me. We're going to do a different gospel account here in a minute that's going to help us understand how they discerned that. But at this point, he just records he's a Galilean. That's where all those people that been connected with Jesus, where all of them came from. That's the conclusion that they make. Peter says, Man, I know not what thou sayest, and immediately what? Immediately the rooster crows. So you've got, just as Jesus had said, right? Before that rooster crows, you will deny me thrice. You'll deny me 3 times. And here they are in Luke's record, one after another listed for us. One person after another comes, each one more vehement, and as they get more vehement that he's with Jesus, Peter what? Yeah, he raises his fervor in the denial. Again, we'll see that more clearly from some of the other narratives. The Lord then, when this rooster crows, Peter recognizes as the Lord turns and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. You know, it's interesting. You ever get in the heat of the moment of some sort or kind, some situation, and you kind of forget things that you'd think, how in the world I could forget that? How could I forget that? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been driving through New Martinsville and forget where I'm going, right? Drive right past it. Oops, there's Walmart. But my point is, it's interesting, isn't it? That wasn't all that long ago that Jesus told him, right? Really, you could count it by hours. We're not talking really days or weeks here. We're talking hours. Since Jesus told him, before that rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. But in the heat of the moment, when Peter was where he probably shouldn't maybe have been, and all of that conversation and challenge and temptation and difficulty of that scene, he's already forgotten the prophecy that was just shared with him a few hours later. And according to Luke's record, it's not until what? Jesus looks at him. The rooster crows, Jesus looks, which tells us he's pretty close, right? You can't generally put eyeballs on somebody without being close enough to do that. And so they're close enough for that to happen. The rooster crows, and then he remembers. And what's his reaction? He goes out and weeps bitterly. Just, I can't imagine the overwhelming feeling he must have had. Number one, just a few hours ago, he said, I will what? Yeah, when Jesus told him this prophecy, he said, no, I'll never do that. I'd just as soon die than deny you, right? Oh, now all that's coming rushing back. And all that confidence that he once had, and all that fervent mindset that he had prior to this moment, all of that comes rushing back, and it's overwhelming. He just goes and weeps bitterly as it relates to that. Go ahead, Amy.
He did this right in front of him. It's not like he's away from him.
Right. I think that if Jesus and Peter are able to lock eyes for a moment after the rooster crows, I think we can fairly say that Jesus was also within eyesight of him the whole time. The whole time. They just maybe never looked at each other as he's kind of witnessing the scene. And then the rooster crows. Then Jesus turns to where Peter was. But yeah, he's been in proximity to Jesus the whole time. Yeah, go ahead.
qualifying wept here, bitter. Is that supposed to be his anger at himself?
I think it's all the above. It's every emotion you can imagine, right? He's upset with himself for what he's done. Certainly he's embarrassed, right? That he just a few hours earlier said, I'd die before I'd deny you. I suppose it's just even the emotion of the idea that I can't believe I forgot. That he just told me this was going to happen a few hours ago, and it took me to the eyes locking. You know, there's all kinds of reasons why he would go out and wept bitterly, but I suppose maybe the biggest reason is the fact that I just denied the Savior.
You know, the verse of Jesus wept. It's not saying how it was, but just wept.
Yeah.
And I was just concerned if this is really him being bitter at those who are questioning him, or bitter at himself for denying him.
Yeah, I would say this is deeply personal. That this is his personal reaction to what he had done. And I think you kind of see that when later after the resurrection and Peter and Jesus have a conversation about it in some ways, about feeding my sheep and that scene. You can kind of see Peter's trying to turn a corner from that. Go ahead.
Later on, Paul talks about godly sorrow. And I think that plays in both. David had the same thing.
Yeah.
Others did. And they sinned.
Yeah.
They trespassed.
So think about that. Let's go back a little bit in the narrative. Jesus told him that he was going to deny him, and then he says, when thou art what? When thou art converted. And he gives him that confidence, right? When you're converted from this. And you know, to get to conversion, you got to work through the godly sorrow first in some ways. You got to work through that recognition and godly sorrow that then leads to genuine change and repentance. And I think you're right. Paul addresses that sentiment with those in Corinth.
Fear that Peter had what also happened to him personally?
That's possible. Any of that's possible, right? He doesn't really, the text, none of the texts that I know of really tell us what's going through his mind except what's the obvious, and that is the denial that. Yeah. Could easily set in. Let me share with you a little bit of things that Luke doesn't talk about. Matthew's record, and if you want to jot, those are the texts that you'll find the comparison of Peter's denial in. Not only does he just say, I don't know him, I don't know him, I don't know him, but in Matthew's record, he does what? He makes an oath. Add that to the weep bitterly moment, right? Add that thought to the went out and wept bitterly, when now you get Matthew's record into the occasion, and now he's not just denied him, he's sworn an oath. I don't know him. And you get that heavierness. Luke records that the evidence they declared was he's a Galilean. Well, that may not be, how do you know that? Well, Matthew's record says, your speech what? Your speech betrayeth you. The way you talk. I am told that people can tell you're from West Virginia by the way you talk. Now, there's no way for me to know that because I'm a West Virginian, right? But you go outside the state, and there are all kinds of people that can almost identify you by the way you talk. And that's true about all kinds of areas and places. They knew by the way he spoke, you're a Galilean. You speak like a Galilean. Matthew also shares with us that he began to what? To curse and to swear. I don't know him. I mean, again, I don't know how much of that to make, but you think about, your speech betrayeth you. You're a Galilean. And then he tries to talk like what? He tries to sound like something completely opposite of what they were accusing him of. He begins to, I think sometimes maybe we miss that possible connectivity, that their accusation is, you talk like a Galilean, so he starts talking not like somebody connected to Jesus by cursing and swearing and that kind of thing. That may very well have been not just his effort to prove and try to get out of this situation and not be connected to Jesus, but it's a method by which to do that. to try to convince them that how could a guy that talks like this be connected to that? And it's just an interesting add from Matthew's record. So there are some additional things that we can appreciate. Mark basically follows the same line that Matthew does. There's not really anything different in Mark's record that Matthew doesn't talk about. So they pretty much align together. John 18 gives some different details about the same timing. John 18, verses 15 through 18 and verses 25 to 27, that's the narrative that matches. John records that another disciple was also there who was known to the high priest. Now, the general consensus is that that was probably... Anybody have? John himself. John often speaks about the one whom Jesus loved when he was talking about himself. The general consensus has been is that John is referring to himself. He just doesn't want to identify himself in the writing in that fashion. And that's not unusual. But again, all we know for absolute, according to John's record, is another one of them was there. And it was somebody that had connectivity to the high priest that could actually get inside. Peter is at a what? Afar off, right? He's on the outside looking in. Apparently, many conclude it's John, but one of the other disciples gets inside. John's record shares. And so Peter, looking from this scene from the outside in, one of the disciples is on the inside who was known to the high priest who was able to get there. And John's record's interesting because John has Peter's initial denial before the trial scene. Then the second and third denials happen after the trial there at the high priest and before he's taken before Pilate. And it'll be somewhat significant as we move forward, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But that's the added narratives. And John's really the one that always seems to, he's just viewing this thing from a different vantage point. And I would argue that if it is correct that it's John that is on the inside looking at this scene, he's got a front row seat, then his perspective would be different. He would be hearing what they were saying in different ways. He would have interactions and situations that would give him a completely different kind of vantage point as to what he was witnessing and hearing that might lead him to record the narrative in different details than the others do. Those to me were the significant additions or extra thoughts from the three other gospel accounts of Peter's denial. And again, I'm going to look more at John 18 before we're done. Just bear with me a little bit. So let's go to the next text. So the next thing in Luke's record is when they begin to mock and shame Jesus in the midst of that trial. That's where Luke's record leads us to in the next moment. So the men that held Jesus mocked him and did what? Smote him, hit him. And it's baffling, right? Go back to the garden, right? Go back to the garden. They arrive at the garden. They don't even know who Jesus is. They get a kiss to identify him. And yet, Jesus is, according to John's record, willing to just kind of say, I'm right here. You don't need, His disciples think that because he told him just earlier that they might want to get a what to take with them? A sword. Peter, we learned, must have thought, well, that means we're going to fight when these guys come. He whacks the ear of Malchus off, right? But Peter says, no. John says, when he talks about that interaction Jesus has with this entourage, he says, listen, why'd you come out here in the middle of the night? I've been in the temple every day. I've been in the middle of the daylight every day. Why didn't you come and take me then? And why did you bring all these swords and weapons with you. I've been no physical threat to anybody. Remember, we studied that Wednesday night. So he's not been any threat whatsoever, but this is how he gets treated in the middle of this mock trial. So they're mocking him. Luke records that they smote him. And when they'd what in verse 20 or 64? Blindfolded him. I think about that and try to, why? And the only reason you blindfold somebody is you don't want them to what? Yeah, be able to identify you. I don't know. Maybe these guys just have enough fear of Jesus because of what they've seen to not want them to be able to identify. But it's interesting. And then they use it to mock him, right? Because now they strike him and hit him on the face and ask him, saying what? Who did that? You're supposed to be so wise and so smart and so intelligent and got all this miraculous. Who did you? Who hit you? So maybe that's why, right? It's a game. You know, the blindfold just becomes part of a game to them, where they're going to strike him and see whether or not he can tell them who it was that hit him. And many other things, Luke says. Blasphemously spake they against him. So they physically abuse him, and then they blasphemously say all kinds of things. Luke doesn't even record that for us. He just says it happens and gives that to us as it relates. But it's just despicable to see what Jesus is enduring at the hands of these supposed religious people, right? That mock him and challenge him in this way. So let me add, to get the bigger picture, and I've shared those texts on the screen with you. So Matthew and Mark, from a order standpoint, from a chronology standpoint, they put the mocking before the denial of Peter. So Luke says Peter denies, and then he talks about the mockings that Jesus went through. Matthew and Mark talk about the mockings that Jesus went through. Then they talk about Peter's denial. John 18, I'm going to argue, seems to be more focused on order than the other three. Have you ever told a story and you get halfway into the account and you go, well, actually before that happened, right? And then you tell some piece that actually happened prior, and then you tell the rest of the story. Sometimes when you're giving a record of something, you're concerned about chronology. You're trying to tell people this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Sometimes you're just what? You're just telling what happened. Yeah, right. Sometimes you're just telling people what happened. I believe that's what Matthew, Mark, and Luke are doing. I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke are just telling people what happened. They are not as focused on the when and the chronology of events as much as I believe John is. Now let me just so you don't have to just take my word for that. You can take my word for it if you want, but I wouldn't do that very often. But let me share with you. Just go back with me. I'm going to share with you a handful. I'm going to start at verse 57. I just want you to notice the style of writing from Luke. Beginning of verse 57, and beginning of verse 58, and beginning of verse 59, and beginning of verse 60, and beginning of verse 61, and beginning of verse 62, and beginning of verse 63, and beginning of verse 64, and beginning of verse 65, and beginning of verse 66. What's your point, Brian? My point is, he's telling a story like you and I would tell a story. And, this happened too. And this happened too. And this happened too. And this happened too. And this happened too. He's not trying to set a when and where so much as he is a what, right? Luke is focused on the what happened. And. He's just adding to the list of historical events that occurred. When you read John's account over in John 18, you get a much different sense of what John is trying to do. Remember, John's recording not a completely different narrative. He's just giving you a different perspective from a different vantage point as it relates to the account. I'm going to quickly run it just to go back to verse 1, and I'll do this as fast as I can for time's sake. So remember, he doesn't even talk about the garden scene, the garden prayer. He just says, spoke these words and went forth with his disciples over the brook to the garden. That's all John tells us. But notice, he's trying to show us all of the events seemingly in chronology. Judas then comes on the scene after the garden, right? That's that narrative where we learn where he converses with the multitude. Who you looking for? I'm the guy. That conversation. But notice some things John shares that the others just kind of allude to. We recognize from John's record that there are how many high priests serving in that day? 2. Now, not necessarily legitimately. There are 2. There's Annas, and then there's Caiaphas. They go to Annas, verse 13 of John 18, first. When you see a word like first, that's telling me that John is what? He's trying to tell me what order things happened in. John is spending time the others don't do necessarily. John is writing in a way that gives me clues that he's trying to give me not just what happened. He's giving me clues in his writings that he's trying to tell me when and in what order they happened. Even as it relates, the other narratives just say he went to the high priest. But John says, well, he did, but he first went to Annas, who was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was actually the high priest that same year. So when they first go and take Jesus, they go to the father-in-law's house. Later they end up among Caiaphas, and that is when you see the rest of that narrative, and it's Caiaphas is the one, that's John's record that we learned that Caiaphas says, well, listen, if one's got to die in order the nation can be saved, and so be it. Right? You see that callous nature of Caiaphas. He feels Jesus is a threat to Israel, and if he's got, even if he's innocent, if he's got to die to save the nation, so be it. That's Caiaphas' attitude. We learn that from John and his record as it relates to that. And I just wanted you to see that. So he, to me, seems to be much more focused on the order of events, not just the events. So he has Peter's initial denial, then the trial before the high priest, and the mockery that came in the midst of that. Then Peter's second and third denials, the rooster crows. Whereas the others just kind of bunch them all what? Yeah, into one moment. Matthew, Mark, and Luke just kind of say, here's what happened. John kind of gives us this much more detailed order of things. And so if I want to understand the order of events, I go to John's record. And I'll see him lay out for me, this happened first, and then this. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. If I want to see more detail about what exactly occurred in those moments, then I add Matthew's record. Then I add Mark's record. And I add Luke's record. They're not in contradiction to each other. And I'm simply going through this exercise with you this morning because some charge, by the way, some argue against the Bible based on the fact that these 4 men don't record the history of these last hours of Jesus in the same order. And they contend that that's proof that the Bible is false because they don't all 4 agree on the order. No. What it means is some of them focused on different aspects of the same events, and it happens all the time in historical narratives. You can read all kinds of historical secular documents, and you'll find some that focus on the what happened, and other documents that focus on the order and the when certain events occurred. And that's not uncommon to these four writers that give us the gospel record of the life of Jesus. Thoughts or questions about that? I'll give you the last 30 and a half seconds. Anything you want to add? And again, that was the most challenging part. Go back and trust me. Go read, if you haven't done it yet, go read John 18. Before you come into the class, Lord willing, on Wednesday, go read John 18, because you'll see what I'm talking about. I think you'll see it more clearly than just me trying to explain it to you. Read it. Go home and read it, because you'll see what I mean by how John he's trying to guide us through the steps and process of what's going on. That some go, some flee. Now one goes clear into the high priest. Then there's Peter, and you've got all this scene, and he's trying to tell us, where'd you go first? Well, they took him to Annas first. Well, then where? Well, they end up with Caiaphas. What happened when he was Caiaphas, right? John writes it completely different. And I think you'll get a clear imagery of order from John's record, and then you'll see details from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so depending on what understanding you're trying to gain, you can appreciate what those four gospel accounts bring to the table.
Also, you have to take into account that Mark and Luke are repeating what they've been told.
Right. They weren't eyewitnesses to all of these things. They are recording as it relates to that. And Matthew as well, not an eyewitness to these things, because the disciples fled, with the exception of whatever one that went into the high priest and Peter, from the narratives that we have. And I appreciate that thought. If you would, let's bow our heads together. Let's share in a word of prayer as we close this morning. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the benefit of worshiping you today and to honor you today. Give us a heart that wants to come together and be compacted together as we honor and serve you and worship you, giving you all praise, honor, and glory. And strengthen us as we understand these sad days of sacrifice of Jesus and the benefit that it brings to us. Give us a heart that's receptive to the great message of salvation in Him. Strengthen us and go with us as we leave today. And we pray all this through Christ's name. Amen.